Hello and welcome to our week of remote learning. I know you guys are super excited for this, but I have some great news. We're going to be reading The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. Doesn't sound exciting, I know, but it's a good book and I think you guys will like it. At the very least, you'll have opinions on it. Okay, so before we start reading, I want to give you guys some historical context, some background info, a little bit of rundown about who Khaled Hosseini is. So let's get right to it. Hosseini is an Afghan American. He was born in 1965 in Kabul, Afghanistan. His father was a diplomat and his mother taught Persian, the language. And he is part Pashtun, which is important for our ethnic relations that we're going to talk about later. And according to him, he had a relatively privileged upbringing. His father being a diplomat, they moved around a bit, and in 1976 they went to Paris for a job his father had, and then in 1978 the Saur Revolution occurred in Afghanistan, so they were unable to return, and shortly after this the Soviet-Afghan War made it impossible to return. So they sought asylum in America. Hosseini recalls hearing news about this violent war and this violent revolution, and he didn't know what happened to many of his friends or his family friends, and still to this day he has no idea. But his life in America afforded him a lot of opportunities. He practiced medicine for 10 years before finally writing his first novel, The Kite Runner, which was published in 2005. After the success of this novel, he wrote one centered around women called A Thousand Splendid Suns, and this was also critically acclaimed. And currently he works as a Goodwill Ambassador for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So he does a lot of important social justice work, especially concerning Afghanistan. Ethnicity is super important in Afghanistan. There are a lot of different ethnic groups in Afghanistan, and which group you're a part of determines a lot about your social standing. So the three main groups are Pashtuns, Tajiks, and Hazaras. Those are the groups that are talked about the most. But we're really only going to focus on the Pashtuns and the Hazaras. The Pashtuns make up about 2/5 of the population, and the Hazaras are about 1/10 of the population, so huge difference there. The Hazaras are a majority Shia ethnic group, so there is a little bit of religious divide there. And Shia, we're going to talk about the different factions in Islam in a second, but just remember Hazaras are Shia, and that's important. So since the Pashtuns are the largest group, they have better employment, access to better education, they have positions of power, positions within the government. They run a lot of important positions in society. And we're gonna see that in some characters in the novel about where they fit in with society because they are Pashtun. A major difference between the Hazaras and the Pashtuns, other than religion, is also the caste system. So the Hazaras are of a lower caste, and you guys might know the caste system from India. Basically, the caste system is a social categorization, a hierarchy based on cultural notions of purity and pollution. India doesn't really go by the caste system so much anymore, but there are still some leftover prejudices from the caste system, and it still kind of lingers on in a bunch of countries in Asia and in the Middle East. Another thing is that Hazaras are generally illiterate, and so they can't educate themselves. It's really difficult for them to educate themselves, for them to teach themselves anything because they are illiterate. And so this lack of education leads to them having lower jobs, like lower status, and it's really difficult to break out of the poverty cycle. So we see with some of the Hazaras in The Kite Runner that they very much stay in the serving class, and it's hard to break out of that, especially remaining illiterate. Another major difference with Hazaras is that their ancestors were Chinese invaders in Afghanistan, so a lot of physical and facial features and characteristics are more Chinese looking, and this becomes a point in which people like the Taliban and a few characters within the novel consider Hazaras not Afghan. They say your ancestors are not Afghan, you're not truly one of us. So this then, one of the main doctrines of the Taliban is to exterminate the Hazaras. And you guys will see in the novel that there are some parallels to Hitler exterminating the Jewish population. There's a character who talks heavily about Hitler's ideals, and we see this very much coming into how the Taliban deals with Hazaras. And finally, another big but maybe not so focused on point is that the Hazaras and Pashtuns tend to live in separate areas. So the Pashtuns tend to live in the south of Afghanistan, whereas the Hazaras are in the more mountainous regions in the central area. So physical separation as well. Now we understand a bit of the ethnic divide. Let's look at the intersecting. Do you guys remember talking about that? I don't know why I'm doing that. Okay, so the intersection of religion and ethnicity. So we're going to look at the two main factions of Islam. And first we're going to kind of do a very quick brief overview of what Islam is and why Afghanistan is seen as a Muslim nation. Okay, so the main philosophy behind Islam is there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. And Allah in Arabic means God, so I'm going to use those two words a little bit interchangeably, even though Muslims tend to refer to God as just Allah. Okay, so background. Muhammad, the prophet. He's from the 7th century, Common Era. And he received, let's look at the two main divisions in Islam. So it's split after Muhammad's death into two different factions, the Sunni and the Shia. So the Sunni make up the largest group of Muslims today, and they believe that after Muhammad's death, the successor did not need to be of Muhammad's bloodline. They believed that anyone pious enough could be his successor and could carry on the leadership. But the Shia felt that Muhammad's successor needed to be of his own bloodline, so needed to be related to him in some way. So from this, we understand that the initial split actually is not religious at all, but it actually is about political leadership. So religious doctrine now does play some sort of role in the split, but back during the initial split, it was purely a political move. It was purely about leadership. Okay, now we're going to turn to the deeply problematic political history of Afghanistan. We only really have time to focus on the period in which the Kite Runner is set. You guys don't also need to know a ton of background, but well, you do actually. I'm gonna cover a lot, so I'm sorry, but just bear with me for this part. Okay, so we're gonna start in the mid-1960s when the main character Amir is born. So at this time, Afghanistan is under a monarchy. The king is King Zahir Shah. He had started some pretty liberal reforms, started looking at a more democratic process. He himself was appointing a lot of deputies, but also there were some elected officials. And it's kind of thought of as his experiment in democracy. That's usually what it's referred to as. And there are some pretty good lasting reforms that came out of it, and he did some pretty terrible things too. But one of the big things is that it allowed for huge growth in extremist parties. And one of the big groups that comes out of it is a communist party called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. So keep in mind that This is happening in the 60s, so this is after World War II. It's during the Cold War, so there is America and the Soviet Union are fighting. You guys probably learned, actually I know you guys learned a little bit about the Cold War in grade 10, so you guys should have some understanding of the background. And Afghanistan at this time was kind of leaning more towards the Soviets and getting the Soviet help, but they were not quite on the bad side of America yet, although there were some steps that I'm going to explain in a second that firmly put them on the side of the Soviets. Let's talk about the end of the monarchy. The prime minister at the time, Daoud, he seized power in 1973 in a non-violent coup when the king was away for health reasons in Italy. Daoud abolished the monarchy, he set up a republic, and he established himself as the prime minister and the president of Afghanistan. This is a very Russian move, not surprising considering their ties to Russia. Anyway, so 1973 is actually the last time that Afghanistan knew a time of peace. Every year since 1973, Afghanistan has been in some sort of conflict. They have either been in a war or a revolution, some type of violent conflict that has completely made the nation unstable. And so, looking particularly at the context of the Kite Runner, we're watching these two boys grow up. The first 10-ish years of their life, relatively peaceful, relatively nice. Amir has a pretty nice life up until 1975, he says. Then there's an incident. And so we're watching these boys' lives reflect kind of the political climate of Afghanistan. There's a certain time in which everything gets turned upside down, and then the country is no longer the same. These boys' lives are no longer the same. So it's this constant idea of turmoil. And we're going to talk more about themes, but it's just really important that you guys know that 1973 to present, Afghanistan has been in constant conflict. Daoud tried to implement a bunch of reforms but was unsuccessful, and in 1978 there was a very violent military coup. It was called the Sour Revolution. If you guys remember what I just talked about with Husseini, the author, being unable to return to Afghanistan, it was because in 1978 the Sour Revolution was quite bloody and it assassinated Daoud and his entire family. So the point of this revolution was the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, was a communist party. And again, thinking back to what I had said about the king creating extremist groups because of his reforms, the Communist Party was one of these extremist groups that was created out of the reforms. So, full circle. The Communist Party then takes control and makes moves to make the state secular and no longer religious, and tries to follow Marxist-Leninist ideologies. And therefore, in doing so, and in trying to become a more modernized nation, the PDPA invites the Soviets to help with this modernization. One important thing to note about Afghanistan becoming a non-Muslim nation under communism is that men were forced to cut their beards, women were not allowed to wear a chador, and mosques were closed, essentially. So we can see, after this, we're going to see how the Taliban implements religious rule. And so we're going to see two extremist ends of Afghanistan. And so you can really get a sense of the upheaval that is happening in the country just by how much changes it's going through in terms of religion. Might be thinking like, oh, but the communist ideas are like super cool. Everyone's equal. That ethnic divide you were talking about, Ms. Jones, that's gone. That religious divide, that's gone. The gender divide, that's gone. Like, everyone's seen as a laborer. Everyone gets educated. Everyone is appreciated. Maybe not as a human, but as a laborer. And like, I get it. I agree. Love it in theory. Would be amazing. no more capitalism is the dream, but like that's just not how it happened. That they made it so bloody and so violent, and they imposed so many rules right away. They didn't take any time to transition or anything. They just basically, like, it wasn't even like a straight to jail thing, like you disagree, straight to jail, overcook, undercook, straight to jail. No one gets that joke. It's fine. But it was basically like, oh, you used to be a Muslim leader, you're dead. Like, no cap. That's straight up what it was. So violent and so bloody, and killed so many people, and so many people in government and the military. Like, they killed so many leaders in the military that they had to replace all of the officers in the military, basically, and they had to train all these officers in 3 months, even though it's supposed to take like years to become an officer or something. I don't know, I'm not in the military, but it's supposed to take years to become an officer, and they killed so many officers that they had to replace them in 3 months, like with 3 months of training, and then these guys are now supposed to be like running the military. It was just an incredibly violent and turbulent time in Afghani history. Because it was so violent and there was like no clear leadership or whatever, the Afghani people started rebelling. Like, obviously this is a super turbulent time. Like, they essentially have no real government. Like, nobody knows who's in charge, really. There's a couple guys fighting for power, but like, let's be real, Soviets didn't care who was in power. They just like were like, oh, another communist state, great, we're building our communist empire. And so the Afghani people were like, oh my god, you took away our religion, you took away our culture, you took away all this stuff that made us Afghanistan, and like now you killed everybody. Like, not cool, bud. Don't agree, would not recommend. So yeah, they started to revolt. And this is when the Soviets were called in. Initially, fun fact, Soviets refused. They were like, we don't care that much. We're not that invested in this. We're not going to come. But eventually they did come, and this is kind of the beginning of the Soviet-Afghan War. Okay, so in 1979, like a year after the Sour Revolution started, the Soviets then were like, okay, the situation is so ridiculous over there that we actually do need to come in and step in and like make sure you guys stay a communist nation. So they did. Soviet Union, 1979, invades Afghanistan, and when this happens, various fundamentalist groups who had actually been resistance groups to like the king, the Communist Party, and Daoud had they then form what is called the Mujahideen. So yeah, essentially that means resistance group. And the Mujahideen gain power and gain kind of a following because they're supported by the United States and Pakistan. And remember, Cold War, United States is like anything to fight communism. So this is like a proxy war. Do you guys know what a proxy war is? Don't know why I'm asking, because like I can't hear your response, but proxy war, essentially, a lot of the time during the Cold War would be like the USSR and the United States fighting a war against each other, but not directly against each other. Like, they would go to Vietnam and fight each other through like supporting and sending like the communist side and like the, the capitalist side, like that. And Korea is another one. The Korean War was also a proxy war. So basically, like, they would fight the war against each other without actually fighting the war against each other, just by using other nations. So Afghanistan was kind of like a proxy war in that way. Anyway, so United States backs the Mujahideen groups, so these resistance groups. And these resistance groups, as I said, are fundamentalists. So they are super strict Islamic groups, like more so than Afghanistan used to be. So this war goes on for about 10 years, and it is not the like World War I kind of trench warfare style where like your enemy's over there and you're over here and you know who the enemy is. This is more like the Vietnam style war where it's guerrilla warfare and you don't, I mean, you can guess who your enemy is just based on like religious appearance and stuff like that, but there is no like solid battleground. The whole country is just kind of war torn and a free for all essentially for shooting and for bombings. So in 1989, the Soviet Union is collapsing, it's really struggling, it's not doing so well. So they retreat and they leave a civil war in Afghanistan. And so in a few years later, in 1994, there's a mujahideen, a group of mujahideen, made up of students who basically had been a super fundamentalist and taught super strict Islamic law. And they took over in Kandahar, the province of Kandahar. And this group was called the Taliban. And I'm sure you guys have heard of the Taliban, or maybe you're vaguely aware of the Taliban. Taliban actually just means student. It's the Arabic word for student. But this group, the Taliban, were such fierce fighters, and they began to dominate larger and larger areas of Afghanistan. And so by 1996, they had taken control of Kabul. A little bit after that, they had control of most of Afghanistan. Like, not all of Afghanistan followed Taliban, but like they definitely had Kabul, which is where the novel is set. And so when the Taliban comes in, a lot of Afghani people are like, yes, amazing. Finally, like we have someone in power, someone who like believes in Islamic law, like someone who really represents the culture, like is for the culture. And so they're, at one point in the book, they talk about how when the Taliban come in, people are cheering in the streets. Like this is seen as like this new era of, it's a stop to the war, the civil war. It can stop, it can be resolved. We now have like a return to Islamic law, like a return to our roots, a return to our culture. Once the Taliban gained control, they really started implementing the strict laws. So some of these restrictions, I've given you guys a list of things, of laws, of rules that women had to abide by, men had to abide by. So some of the rules on this list are like no education for women. Women aren't allowed to work. Women aren't allowed to associate with men. Women aren't allowed to be filmed. They have to wear a burqa, like a full body covering. And one of the things that's really relevant to the book is that there's a ban on kite flying too. Okay, so a little bit about kite fighting. I mean, there is some symbolic meaning behind the Taliban banning kites because a kite flies up and it's free, and it also represents childhood joy. But yeah, so kite fighting is a national pastime essentially. In the fight, two kites are up in the air and they're close to each other, and the string that the kite is on is like coated in glass, and so the object is to like cut the other person's string with your kite and then have your kite still be up and the other person's kite like fall down. And so once the other person's kite is cut and it falls down, then these kites are free and legal, so anyone can run after them and get the kite, and then it's their kite. And so that is Amir and Hassan. Their relationship is Amir is the kite fighter and Hassan is the kite runner. So he goes and he retrieves the kites for Amir. I just think that's beautiful. But yeah, so the Taliban bans this, which is, you know, essentially further depriving children of their right to a childhood. Like, they are already growing up in this war-torn country and now they can't even enjoy something that is part of their culture. We're not going to go into detail today about the Americans helping the Taliban to power and then that whole ironic situation. We will talk about it a bit later though. But that's all the background information you need for now. Thank you for sitting through that. I know it was a lot and I know you probably forgot most of it, but if you did, that's fine. Fill in the worksheets, understand where Afghanistan is on a map, understand Taliban laws and what is so strict about them, and do the reading. And that's pretty much it. Okay, watch the next video once you've done the reading.